The timber slipped in Ellen Hadley's grip for the third time that morning, and she told herself, as she had told herself every miserable day for the past 11 months, that she was not going to cry about it. The mud in the yard of the Hadley homestead outside Calico Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878, was the particular kind of mud that seemed to have opinions about a person. It sucked at her boots with something close to malice, and it made every step across the yard feel like an argument. Ellen had been losing that argument since before sunrise, hauling rough-cut cedar posts from the edge of the tree line to the collapsed corner of the south fence, one at a time, because there was no one else to do it, and because the fence had to be standing before the first freeze came down off the caprock, or she would lose what remained of her small herd to open range and the wolves that ran it at night. Her husband, Robert Hadley, had been dead since October of the previous year. He had been thrown from his horse during a cattle drive through rough canyon country north of the Brazos, and by the time they brought him back to her, he was already gone. He had been 34 years old and strong as a post oak, and the world had decided that was sufficient for one life. Ellen had been 31 at the time of his death. She was 32 now, and she felt, on mornings like this one, considerably older. She was not a large woman. She was lean in the way that hard work makes a person lean, with dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to Robert and hands that were rough and capable, but trembling slightly now from the cold and the weight of the timber. The cedar post she was dragging was easily 7 feet long and too heavy for one person to carry without bracing it against the hip and leaning back into the mud like a mule pulling a plow. She had done it 6 times already. She needed to do it 4 more. The road that ran along the northern edge of her property was a red dirt track that turned to red clay soup in the rain, and it had rained 2 days previous and would likely rain again by nightfall. The road was not well traveled. The nearest town, Calico Creek, was 4 miles to the east, and the only other property of consequence in this direction was the Underwood Ranch, which sat 2 miles to the west on a stretch of rolling grass that the locals talked about with a kind of reverence generally reserved for church. Ellen had not been paying attention to the road. She had been paying attention to her boots and to the timber and to the mud and to the fence posts she had already planted and whether the spacing was correct, because Robert had always been particular about fence spacing, and she had made herself be particular about it too, as a way of honoring something she could not exactly name. So she did not see the rider slow on the road. She did not see him stop. She did not see him sit on his horse for a long moment, watching the yard with the kind of stillness that a man only achieves when he is trying very hard to make a decision about something. She only became aware of him when the mud around her right boot released with a horrible sucking sound at the worst possible moment, and the cedar post swung sideways, and she went down hard on one knee into the wet earth and said something that she would not have said in polite company. "Ma'am." The voice came from the road, and Ellen's head came up fast. Her hat had tilted forward over her eyes, and she pushed it back with a muddy forearm, and saw the man on the road clearly for the first time, though she had seen him before in the peripheral way that neighbors exist in isolated country, as a figure on a distant horse, a name spoken in the hardware store, a hat raised in passing. Graham Underwood was 38 years old and had been running the Underwood cattle operation since his father passed 6 years prior. He was a large man, not in the thick, soft way, but in the way of someone who had spent his whole life doing physical work in open country. He had broad shoulders and dark brown hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been put together with intention. He was wearing a long canvas duster against the cold, and his hat was the deep brown of old leather, pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had pushed it back when he stopped, the unconscious gesture of a man removing a barrier between himself and something he was trying to look at directly. His horse, a large gray gelding, stood with the patience of a well-trained animal while Graham looked at Ellen in the mud and Ellen looked at Graham on the road. "Are you hurt?" Graham said. "No," Ellen said. She was already pushing herself up, getting her knee free of the mud, refusing to be anything other than upright in front of another person. "That is a considerable piece of timber for one person," Graham said. "I am aware of that," Ellen said. There was a silence. The wind moved through the grass along the road and made a low sound. Graham's horse shifted its weight. "Mrs. Hadley," Graham said, and something in his voice changed, some carefully maintained neutrality giving way to something that sounded, to Ellen's surprised ear, like honesty. "I have been riding past this window of road for weeks now, since the summer turned, if I am being truthful. I have watched your light on in the mornings before anyone else is stirring and watched it still burning after dark, and I have watched you working this place alone, and I have told myself every single time that it was not my business and that you were a private woman who had not asked for anything from anyone." Ellen was very still, holding the cedar post against her hip, listening. "I cannot ride past again," Graham said. He said it simply, the way a man states something that has become undeniable. "I just cannot do it, not today." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. The wind came again, colder this time, carrying the smell of distant rain. She was 32 years old, and she had been managing grief and a failing ranch and a collapsed south fence and a herd of 31 cattle that had been 67 cattle when Robert was alive, and she had been managing all of it alone. And something about the plainness of what Graham Underwood had just said made a place behind her sternum ache in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "The fence posts need to go along the south line," Ellen said finally. "4 more of them." Graham Underwood swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion and looped the reins around the fence rail and walked through the gate without being invited. He picked up the cedar post from where she had dropped it when she fell, and he carried it as though it weighed nothing, and he started toward the south line, and Ellen Hadley stood for one moment in the mud watching him go, and then she picked up the next post and followed. They worked together for 2 hours without talking very much, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way that silence between strangers usually is. It had a quality to it, that silence, the quality of 2 people who are paying close attention to each other without wanting to be obvious about it. Ellen noticed the way Graham set a post, decisive and exact. Graham noticed the way Ellen checked his spacing and found it acceptable, that small involuntary nod she gave that she was probably not aware of. By the time they had the 4 posts in the ground and the wire run between them, the sky had gone from pale gray to the deeper gray that preceded rain, and Ellen's fingers were stiff with cold. "Thank you," she said. She meant it simply and said it simply, but she looked at him when she said it. "It was not a favor," Graham said. "Or it was, but it was also something I needed to do. I am not certain I can explain the difference." "You do not have to explain it," Ellen said. Graham nodded. He looked out across the south pasture, where her cattle were moving slowly through the brown grass, and then he looked back at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not immediately categorize. It was not pity, which she had been receiving from people for 11 months and which she despised. It was not the particular sort of uncomfortable performance that people made when they were around grief. It was something more direct than either of those things. "Your herd is smaller than it was," Graham said. "Yes," Ellen said. "Did you lose them or sell them?" "Some of both," she said. "I had to pay off debts after Robert died. We had borrowed against the spring drive, and there was no drive that year. I sold off about 20 head to the buyer that comes through in June, lost a few to illness in the summer." Graham was quiet, processing this with the straightforward arithmetic of a cattleman. 30 head will not carry this place through the winter," he said. "No," Ellen said. "I know that. What is your plan?" It was a direct question, and she appreciated it for exactly that reason. Most people were too careful around her, too soft, as though she might shatter if they asked her a real question. Ellen had not shattered. She had bent in some fundamental way that she was not sure was ever going to reverse itself, but she had not shattered. "My plan," she said, "is to keep the 30 head alive and hope for a good spring calf crop and sell in June. Beyond that I have not decided. Graham looked at her for another moment. "You are thinking about leaving," he said. It was not a question. Ellen's jaw tightened. "I am thinking about a great many things," she said. "I see." He picked up his hat, which he had set on the fence post while they worked, and settled it back on his head. "I do not mean to press into your business." "You are not pressing," Ellen said, which surprised her slightly as she said it, because it was true. Graham walked back toward the gate and his horse, and Ellen walked alongside him, and the rain held off for exactly long enough for them to reach the gate before the first drops began to fall, large drops that hit the mud with little craters of impact. Graham untied his horse and looked at her once more. His expression was the expression of a man who has said more than he intended to say already, and is deciding whether to say one more thing. "I will come back tomorrow," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." Ellen stood in the rain that was now beginning in earnest, her hat doing its best, and she looked at Graham Underwood and thought about Robert and thought about the fence and thought about 31 cattle and thought about the light that burned in her window before anyone else was stirring and after dark, and she said, "That is agreeable." Graham nodded once, a decisive small motion, and mounted his horse and rode west on the red clay road that was already running with thin streams of rainwater. And Ellen Hadley stood at her gate in the rain and watched him go, and was not sure at all what she was feeling, but she was fairly sure it was something. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the window that faced the road, and she thought about the fact that he had said he had been watching that window for weeks, and she did not know what to do with that, except that it was warm to think about, which made her feel guilty, and the guilt made her angry, and then she was just tired, and she sat down at the kitchen table and drank her coffee in the gathering dark while the rain came down. The next morning Graham came back, as he had said he would, and he brought 2 of his ranch hands with him, young men named Pete and Calhoun, and without any discussion of arrangement or payment, the 3 of them spent the morning repairing the east section of Ellen's barn roof, which had been leaking since September, and which she had been patching inadequately with what materials she had. Ellen cooked them all a noon meal of salt pork and beans and cornbread, and they ate at her kitchen table, and Pete and Calhoun were respectful and a little shy in the way of young men around a woman they have been told to behave around, and Graham sat across from her and said very little but ate everything on his plate and said that the cornbread was the best he had eaten since his mother's. "Where is your mother now?" Ellen asked. "She passed 4 years ago," Graham said. "She went back to Georgia after my father died, and she passed there in the house where she grew up. She was happy there at the end. She always said Texas was too dry for her blood. She never took to it." "She took to my father," Graham said. "The land was a condition of him. She endured it for love of him and was relieved when the obligation passed." Ellen smiled at that, a real smile that she had not expected, and Graham looked at her smile with an expression that he quickly rearranged into something more neutral, but not before she caught it. After Pete and Calhoun had gone back to the barn to finish the last section of roofing, Ellen and Graham stood on the porch in the thin autumn sunlight, and Graham held his coffee cup in both hands against the cold and looked out at the land. "How much of this is yours outright?" he asked. "The deed, I mean." "The house and the 80 acres around it are mine," Ellen said. "Robert had it recorded in both our names when we married. There are another 120 acres on the lease from the Caldwell Land Office, but that lease comes due in March, and the renewal fee is $40 that I do not currently have." "What happens to your grazing if you lose the lease?" "I lose the south and west pastures," Ellen said. "I would still have the immediate property, but not enough grazing for even 30 head. Graham drank his coffee. A hawk was circling high over the east pasture, riding the cold air in slow spirals. "The Caldwell office is run by a man named Fitch," Graham said. "He is not unreasonable if you go to him directly. He prefers to keep working ranches on the land rather than leave it fallow." "I know who Fitch is," Ellen said. "I have been to see him twice. He was sympathetic both times and told me the same thing both times, which is that sympathy does not change the fee schedule." Graham made a sound that was not quite a laugh but acknowledged the quality of that observation. "No," he said, "it does not." They were quiet for a moment. "You could let me pay the renewal fee," Graham said. He said it carefully, the way a person says something they know might be received badly. Ellen felt her spine straighten. "No," she said. "It would be a loan," Graham said, "against the spring calf sale." "Mr. Underwood," Ellen said, "I appreciate what you are doing, what you did yesterday and what you did today with your men. I appreciate it more than I have probably made clear, but I will not take money from you." Graham looked at her. "May I ask why?" "Because I do not want to owe you money," Ellen said. "Because owing money to neighbors is how good neighbors become complicated neighbors, and you are the only neighbor I have who has been willing to come out here and actually help instead of sending condolences and waiting for me to fail." Graham was quiet for a moment. "That is a reasonable position," he said. "Thank you," Ellen said. "I am going to think about it anyway," Graham said, "because I am that sort of person." Ellen looked at him with something that was almost amusement. "What sort of person is that?" "The sort that keeps thinking about a problem even after the person with the problem has told them to stop," Graham said. Ellen shook her head slightly, but she was still almost smiling, and Graham saw it, and something in his face opened up very slightly, like a door cracked just enough to let light through. Pete and Calhoun finished the roof by mid-afternoon and rode back to the Underwood ranch, and Graham stayed another hour, helping Ellen move a section of weakened fence along the north pasture. They worked in companionable silence again, passing tools between them with the easy coordination of people who have figured out each other's rhythms. And when the work was done and Graham was ready to go, he stood at his horse a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I would like to come again on Saturday," he said, "if you will permit it." Ellen looked at him in the late afternoon light. The sun was dropping behind the caprock and the sky was doing something remarkable with orange and dark blue, the kind of sky that made the harsh country look briefly and deceptively beautiful. "Saturday," she said. "Yes, I will have something for the men to do as well if they are willing to come." "They will come," Graham said. "I will make sure of it." He rode away, and Ellen watched the road until he disappeared in the dusk. That night she sat at the kitchen table again, but this time she did not feel only tired. She felt something else alongside the tired, something that she had not felt in so long that she almost did not recognize it. It was not happiness, exactly, or not yet. It was more like the thing that precedes happiness, the possibility of it, the way the air smells different before rain. She felt guilty about that too, because she still thought about Robert every day, and the guilt of feeling something that was not grief felt like a kind of betrayal, and she sat with that for a long time in the lamplit kitchen, while the coyotes called to each other out in the dark country. But she did not put out the lamp and go to bed. She sat there and let herself feel the complicated thing that it was, and she thought about a man on a gray horse who had said he could not ride past again, and she thought it was strange and true and maybe good. On Saturday Graham came, as promised, and this time he brought Pete and Calhoun and also a third man, older, named Darnell, who was the Underwood Ranch's fence specialist, and who regarded Ellen's remaining fencing with the clinical disapproval of a craftsman looking at someone else's inferior work. He spent the whole day repairing what could be repaired and marking what needed to be replaced, and by the end of it, he had produced a written list that Ellen found both horrifying in its length and deeply comforting in its specificity, because at least now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. Graham worked alongside her rather than directing, which she had noticed both times before and was noticing again. He did not stand back and supervise. He got his hands dirty. He hammered and dug and pulled wire and did not say anything that required her to feel inferior about the state of her property. In the late afternoon, with the work done and the men sitting on the porch, Ellen went inside and made coffee and then stood for a moment in the kitchen, just stood there with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of voices from the porch. The house had been so quiet for so long that other voices in it felt strange and necessary at the same time, like light in a room that had been dark. She brought the coffee out and handed cups around and sat on the porch step, and Darnell told a story about a fence he had once built for a rancher down in the hill country that had turned out to be partially on the wrong man's land, and the legal proceedings that followed, and it was a good story, and Ellen laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly without warning. Graham looked at her when she laughed. He was not subtle about it. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been hoping for. Pete and Calhoun and Darnell rode back in the early evening, and Graham stayed to help Ellen carry water to the barn stock, which was a task that took 2 people most efficiently, and they carried the buckets from the well in the gathering dusk, and neither of them said anything for a while, and then Graham said, "Tell me about how you came to be in Calico Creek." Ellen handed him an empty bucket. Robert had a cousin here who wrote to him about the land. We were in Missouri, on his family's farm, and we were young and ambitious, and Missouri in the middle of winter makes a person believe that anywhere with more sun must be better. We came out in the spring of 1869. You were young, Graham said. I was 23, Ellen said. Robert was 25. We thought we knew a great deal. And did you? We knew how to work, Ellen said. That turned out to be the important thing. What about you? Graham asked. Before Robert, where were you from? Indiana, Ellen said. A small town in the south of the state. My father was a school teacher. I was the second of 4 daughters. A schoolteacher's daughter, Graham said. You can read well then. Better than most, Ellen said without false modesty. I can figure and write a clear letter. My father believed in education for his daughters with an unusual conviction for the time, and I have been grateful for it every day of my life. What does your father think of Texas? Graham asked. He has never been here, Ellen said. He died while Robert and I were in Missouri before we came west, and my mother passed the winter after we arrived in Calico Creek. She never saw the place. I am sorry, Graham said, and unlike when most people said it, he sounded like he actually meant the specific thing and not just a general condolence. I have been sorry a long time, Ellen said. You do learn to carry it. It becomes a different shape after a while. They reached the barn and set the last buckets down, and the cattle moved toward the water with their slow, unhurried certainty, and the barn was warm and dim and smelled of hay and animals, and it was the most comfortable Ellen had felt in a long time. Graham, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. What made you stop watching and actually stop your horse? Last week. What made that day different from all the other days? Graham was quiet for a moment. His hands were resting on the top rail of the stall gate, and he was looking at the cattle drinking. I saw you fall, he said. I had been watching, like I told you, and I had been telling myself that you were managing and that you had not asked for anything, and that a widow's grief was a private thing that a man had no right to intrude on. But when I saw you fall in the mud with that timber, something in me just refused to accept the logic of staying on the road anymore. Ellen looked at the side of his face. And you had been watching since summer. Since June, Graham said. He turned to look at her, and his honesty was the quality of a man who has decided not to be careful anymore. I saw you at the Calico Creek Mercantile in June. You were arguing with the clerk about the price of salt, and you were entirely right about the price, and he was entirely wrong, and you proved it to him with arithmetic, and I thought you were the most formidable and interesting person I had seen in a very long time. Ellen blinked. You were there that day. I was standing by the door, Graham said. You did not notice me. I was focused on the arithmetic, Ellen said. I know, Graham said. That was exactly the point. They looked at each other in the barn's warm dimness, and something passed between them that was clear and real, and a little frightening in the way that real things often are. I should not have told you that, Graham said. It probably sounds peculiar. It does not sound peculiar, Ellen said. It sounds honest. I am trying to be honest, Graham said. I am not always skilled at it. You seem skilled at it to me, Ellen said. Graham looked at her a moment longer and then looked away. I should let you get to your supper, he said. Yes, Ellen said, but neither of them moved immediately. Then they did move, and Graham walked to his horse and mounted up, and Ellen stood at the barn door watching him go, and as he reached the gate he pulled up and looked back. "Next Thursday," he said. "I need to go to Calico Creek for supplies. Would you like to come? I could make it a joint trip if you have needs at the mercantile." Ellen considered it. It was a practical offer. It was also something more than a practical offer, and they both knew it. "I have a list for the mercantile," she said. "Thursday is fine." He rode away, and she went inside and cooked her supper and ate it alone, which she was used to, and then she sat by the fire and permitted herself to think about Thursday with something that was, she decided, cautious and well-earned hope. The town of Calico Creek had been established in 1871 as a supply depot along a cattle route, and had grown into a proper small town with a main street of wooden storefronts, a church, a school, a livery, 2 saloons, a hotel, a barber shop, and a land office. By 1878, it had about 400 permanent residents, and it had the particular character of a Texas Plains town in the post-Civil War period, which meant that it was rough around the edges and practical-minded, and not inclined to sentimentality but capable, in its best moments, of a rugged kind of community. Ellen had been coming to town for 9 years and knew most people by name and was known in turn, and since Robert's death she had been known as the widow Hadley, which was the particular kind of social category that made people speak carefully around you and look at you with a mixture of sympathy and mild anxiety, as though grief might be infectious. She and Graham drove in Thursday morning on his wagon because he was picking up lumber and feed, and she had given him her list, and the practicality of the joint trip made it easy to explain to herself. It was an arrangement, that was all. 2 neighbors managing their supply needs efficiently. But when they came down the main street of Calico Creek, and people saw them together on the wagon seat, she felt the quality of attention that moved through the small pockets of people on the boardwalk, the particular interest that a small town takes in the appearance of a widow in the company of an available man, and she felt simultaneously amused by it and self-conscious about it. Martha Greer, who ran the dry goods counter at the mercantile, and who was Ellen's nearest approximation of a friend in Calico Creek, was very careful and very transparent in her curiosity. "Good morning, Ellen," Martha said, and then looked at Graham and back at Ellen with an expression of compressed and barely contained interest. "Good morning, Martha," Ellen said. "This is Graham Underwood. He has the ranch 2 miles west." "Mr. Underwood," Martha said warmly. "I believe I know your ranch hand Darnell. He comes in for tobacco." "He does," Graham said pleasantly. Martha found things to do very slowly in Ellen's vicinity, while Ellen went through her list, and Ellen ignored this with practiced dignity. She got her flour and salt and lamp oil and the thread she needed, and the 2 medicine bottles the catalog had finally delivered, and Graham settled the bill without consulting her about it, which she caught and turned to address. "I have money," Ellen said quietly. "I know you do," Graham said. "I was paying my own bill. Your list is on the counter." Ellen turned back and saw that Martha had separated the 2 orders and that Graham had indeed only paid his own. She felt slightly foolish and paid her own account and did not look at Graham, but she heard, or thought she heard, a very quiet breath of amusement. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, which was the only establishment in Calico Creek where a woman could eat a respectable meal in mixed company without comment, and they sat across from each other at a small table by the window that looked out on the main street, and Ellen watched the street and Graham watched Ellen, and then looked at the street when she looked at him, which they both pretended was not happening. The food was decent, beef stew and good bread, and they talked about practical things for a while: the price of cattle feed, the likelihood of an early freeze based on the thickness of the prairie grass, whether the county was going to improve the road north of town as the commissioner had been promising for 2 years. And then Graham said, "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with the ranch." Ellen looked up from her stew. "That is an unusual request." "I know," Graham said. "I am curious about you." Ellen thought for a moment. "I read," she said, "every night before I sleep. I have 17 books, and I have read each of them at least 3 times, and I keep a running account in my head of which passages are worth returning to." "What kind of books?" Graham asked. "All kinds," Ellen said. "I have 2 novels. One of them is a Dickens that my father gave me before he died. I have a history of the Roman Empire that Robert thought I was strange for liking. I have a book of poetry that belonged to my mother. And I have practical books, a farming almanac and a medical guide and a book about astronomy." "Astronomy," Graham said. "The stars are quite clear out here," Ellen said. "There is not much to recommend about this country at night except that the stars are extraordinary." "That is true," Graham said. "I had never thought about it in those terms, but it is true." He paused. "I read as well, mostly history and law. My father had a legal education before he came west, and he left me his books." "Law," Ellen said with interest. "Have you ever thought of practicing it?" "I thought about it when I was young," Graham said. "But I loved the land more than I loved the idea of courtrooms, and when my father died and the ranch came to me, I found that I did not mind the choice I had made." "Do you have family?" Ellen asked. "Besides the hands?" "I have a sister," Graham said. "Helen. She is married to a newspaper editor in San Antonio and has 3 children and writes to me once a month with what she calls news, and what is actually a comprehensive account of my personal failures and shortcomings." Ellen smiled at that. "She sounds like she cares about you." "She is the most aggravating person I have ever loved," Graham said. "She has been after me since my 30th birthday to marry, and she is not subtle about it." "Have you been close to it?" Ellen asked. "Marrying?" She asked it before she thought about whether it was a forward question, and then thought about it and looked at her stew. "Once," Graham said. "About 6 years ago. A woman from Abilene. It became clear that she did not want the ranch, and she became clear that I did not want to leave it, and we parted on civil terms, and she married a lawyer in Houston the following year." "I am sorry," Ellen said. "Do not be," Graham said. "It was the right outcome for both of us. I was not ready for it at the time, though I thought I was." Ellen looked at him. "And now," she said. Graham met her eyes. "Now I am considerably more ready," he said, "and considerably more aware of what I want." The sentence sat on the table between them like a thing with weight and shape, and Ellen felt her cheeks warm, which had not happened to her in so long that the physical sensation was almost startling. "Graham," she said carefully. "I am not pressing you," he said, and his voice was gentle. "I am being honest, like I said I was trying to be. I am not expecting anything in return for the honesty." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. "I am still finding my way," she said. "After Robert. I am not yet sure what shape the path is." "I understand that," Graham said. "I am patient." "I know you are," Ellen said. "That is one of the things I have noticed about you." They finished their lunch and drove back to the homestead in the afternoon light, and the conversation on the drive was easy and comfortable. And when Graham helped her down from the wagon and carried her supplies inside, he stood in her kitchen for a moment looking at her 17 books lined up on the shelf above the hearth, and he went over and read the spines without touching them with the genuine interest of a fellow reader. "The Dickens," he said, finding it. "Which one?" "Bleak House," Ellen said. "It is not the cheerful choice, perhaps." "It is the right choice," Graham said. "It is the best one." Ellen looked at him standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hand, reading the spine of her father's Dickens, and she felt something shift very quietly inside her, the way a door shifts when the latch releases. Not swinging open, not yet, just releasing. Over the following weeks, Graham came by the homestead with a regularity that stopped being surprising and started being something Ellen looked forward to, which she examined carefully and did not quite know what to do with. He always brought something useful, a length of fence wire, a bag of feed, a tool she had mentioned needing in passing. He never made the gift of these things into a moment of charity. He simply produced them as part of the work, matter-of-factly, the way a practical person solves a problem without requiring acknowledgement of their generosity. He helped her plan the winter feeding for the cattle with the kind of specific regional knowledge that only a man who had run these same plains for 30 years could have. He showed her where on the property the wind broke least severely, and suggested she work the herd toward that shelter when the northers came. He helped her calculate what feed stock she would need to get through to spring and worked out a supply schedule that was actually feasible on her budget. He also, increasingly, simply talked with her. They talked in the evenings on the porch when the work was done, in the fading light with their coffee cups, and sometimes a lamp brought out as the darkness came early the way it did in November. They talked about books and about the country and about people they knew and about the nature of cattle ranching, which both of them found more interesting to discuss than almost any other subject, and about their families and about the past. Ellen talked about Robert less than she expected to, and when she did talk about him, it was with Graham's quiet and respectful attention, and she noticed that he never looked uncomfortable when Robert came into the conversation, never tried to redirect away from it, simply listened and sometimes asked a question. And the effect of this was that talking about Robert felt possible, and even, occasionally, good, the way grieving sometimes turns into gratitude if the context is right. In the second week of November, there was a norther that came down from the Panhandle, with the full force of the Texas winter behind it, dropping the temperature 40 degrees in a matter of hours, the kind of weather event that killed unprepared livestock and frightened unprepared people. Ellen had been watching the clouds build to the northwest for 2 days and had done everything she knew to prepare, gotten the cattle to the sheltered end of the south pasture, double-latched the barn, filled every container she had with water before it could freeze. Graham arrived at her gate at first light the morning the norther hit, before she had even gotten to the barn, which meant he had ridden 2 miles in the dark in weather that was already brutal. Ellen came out of the house in her coat and saw him at the gate and felt something that was large and warm move through her chest. "You rode out in this," she said. "You are on the wrong end of your pasture for this wind," Graham said, practical and immediate. "We need to move the cattle to the draw on the north side of your property. It cuts the wind better than the south pasture shelter. I should have told you about the draw earlier." They spent 3 hours in the norther working the cattle, and it was the hardest weather Ellen had worked in since Robert died, the kind of cold that makes your face numb and your fingers stop working properly, and your ears sing with it. Graham worked beside her the whole time, and they moved 31 cattle through howling wind and occasional spitting snow, and got them into the draw where the cut of the land broke the wind to something manageable, and they got the cattle settled and walked back to the house leaning into the wind. Inside, Ellen made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table with their hands wrapped around the cups, both of them coated in frost and windburn, and neither of them said much because they did not need to. After a long warm silence, Ellen said, "Why did you not just send one of your men? You could have sent Pete." Graham looked at her over his coffee cup. "Because I was worried about you," he said. "Not your cattle, you." Ellen looked at him. The wind was screaming outside the kitchen walls, and the fire in the hearth was doing its best, and the lamp was burning, and Graham Underwood was sitting across from her, with frost still in his hair, looking at her with the straightforward, honest worry of a man who has stopped pretending that his concern is merely neighborly. Ellen set down her coffee cup. She had been thinking about this for weeks. She had been thinking about it with care and with some struggle, because caring about someone new after Robert felt complicated in a way that she had not finished working out. But sitting in this kitchen in this storm, looking at this man who had ridden 2 miles in the dark in brutal cold because he was worried about her, she realized that the working out was perhaps already further along than she had understood. "Graham," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to say something and I want you to let me finish it." "All right," he said. "When Robert died," Ellen said, "I told myself that the part of me that loved someone was finished, not as a conscious decision but as a fact. I thought that part had closed up, the way a wound closes, and I was not unhappy about it. I was relieved, actually, because loving someone and losing them is the worst thing I know, and I thought that at least I was safe from it again." Graham was very still, listening. "But you have been coming here for weeks," Ellen said, "and you have been honest with me in a way that almost no one is honest, and you have sat at my table and worked my fence and ridden out in a norther because you were worried not about my cattle but about me, and I find that I am not as closed as I believed I was." She paused. "I find that I am glad of your company, more than glad. I find that the days when you come I feel a thing that I had thought I would not feel again, and I do not know what to do with that except to say it plainly, because plainness is what I respect and what I think you also respect." Graham looked at her for a long time. The fire crackled. "Ellen," he said, and his voice was different, lower, the controlled steadiness of a man who is feeling something significant. "I have been careful with you because I did not want to put any pressure on your grief or your independence. But I have been wanting to say for weeks that you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life. Not remarkable because you are alone and managing. Remarkable because of who you are, your mind, the way you approach a problem, the way you read your father's Dickens 3 times and keep a running account of the good passages, the way you proved the clerk wrong with arithmetic and did not make him feel small about it, the way you were already preparing for this norther 2 days before it hit." He stopped. He was still holding his coffee cup. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing, not push you toward anything. Just spend time in your company and see what time tells us." Ellen looked at him. Outside, the norther howled. Inside, the fire and the lamp made the kitchen warm and amber-lit. "Yes," Ellen said. "I am willing." Graham's expression changed in a way that she thought she would remember for a long time. It was not triumph or satisfaction. It was relief, and behind the relief something tender. The courting was, as Graham had said it would be, unhurried. It had the quality of people who are serious about something, and therefore not in a rush about it. They continued to spend time working and talking, and they also began, more deliberately, to spend time together in ways that were purely for the pleasure of each other's company rather than for practical necessity. Graham took her to a church social in Calico Creek in late November, and they sat together through the meal and the singing, and Martha Greer observed this with an expression of barely contained triumph and squeezed Ellen's arm afterward and said, in a low voice full of genuine warmth, "He has been alone too long, and so have you, and I am very pleased." Ellen said, "Martha, do not start planning anything," and Martha said, "I am only observing," and her expression made it clear that she was doing considerably more than observing. They drove back in the dark with the stars out in the extraordinary clear way that Ellen had described to Graham, and Graham pulled the wagon up on the open flat north of the road where the sky was widest, and they sat for a while, and he let her name the constellations, because she knew them and he did not, and she pointed out Orion and the Pleiades and Cassiopeia. And Graham watched the stars and watched her face in the dark with the expression of a man who has found himself somewhere he had not expected to find himself, and is extremely glad of it. He drove her home and walked her to the door, and on the porch in the cold he held her hand, just held it, both of them in their coats in the sharp November cold, and it was the first time they had touched deliberately, and it was a quiet and serious and warm thing. December came, and with it the practical challenge of getting through the winter. Ellen's cattle were doing well in the draw, which turned out to be exactly as sheltered as Graham had said, and the feed was holding because they had calculated it carefully. Graham came to the homestead 2 or 3 times a week, and Ellen rode over to the Underwood ranch twice, which was the first time she had been off her own property for anything other than town in nearly a year. The Underwood ranch was larger and better established than her own, which was no surprise. It had been built over 3 generations and showed it. The main house was solidly built of stone and timber, 2 stories, with a wide porch that faced west. The barn was large and orderly. The bunkhouse for the hands was properly maintained. Graham ran it with the quiet authority of a man who knows every inch of his land and every person who works it. He showed her around with the same matter-of-fact honesty he brought to everything, not showing off but simply letting her see the place. And when she asked questions, he answered them specifically. And when she made observations, he listened to them with real attention. She had dinner at his table one December evening with Pete and Calhoun and Darnell, and the meal was cooked by the ranch's cook, an older man named Henry who had been with the Underwood operation for 15 years, and it was a good meal and good company. And she sat at that table and thought about what it would mean to be part of this specific life in this specific place, and the thought did not frighten her the way she might have expected. In January, Graham took care of the lease renewal fee for Ellen's property, and this time she did not refuse it, because they had discussed it plainly and had agreed that it was a loan against the spring sale and that the terms would be written down, which Graham did at her insistence. A simple clear note on paper that she kept in the tin box where she kept her important documents. The note satisfied her in a way that the original offer of charity had not, because it was a transaction between equals, not a gift from someone with more to someone with less. Fitch at the land office processed the renewal without comment, and Ellen walked out of the Caldwell land office with the renewed lease in her hands and Graham beside her, and felt the specific relief of a problem solved that has been looming for months. February was the month that things changed. Graham had been coming to the homestead on a Tuesday when the weather permitted, and one Tuesday he came and Ellen had been crying, which she had not been doing in front of anyone for nearly a year and a half. She had been going through a box of Robert's things that she had put away after the funeral and had not opened since, because she had known she was not ready for it and had been putting it off, and she had chosen that particular morning to open it, which turned out to have been an optimistic assessment of her readiness. Graham came into the kitchen and found her at the table with Robert's things spread around her: a watch, a pair of gloves, a small prayer book, some letters, and her face was composed but her eyes were red, and she did not make any move to hide it because she was past pretending that she was made of stone. Graham pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and did not say anything, just sat there, present and quiet, while she finished what she was doing, going through the box methodically, deciding what to keep in the tin box and what to put back and what to put into the small cedar chest that she was keeping for the memory of it. When she was done and the box was sorted, Graham said, "Is there anything you want to tell me about him?" Ellen looked up. "About Robert?" "Whatever you want," Graham said. "I would like to know who he was to you." And Ellen, who had talked about Robert in the practical sense, the ranch, the debts, the drive that killed him, and had not talked about Robert in the human sense with anyone in over a year, found that she could. She told Graham about Robert Hadley as a person. She told him about the way Robert laughed, which was loud and uncomplicated and came from somewhere deep. She told him about the way Robert could not carry a tune but sang to the cattle anyway, convinced that they appreciated it. She told him about how Robert had cried privately when he lost a calf in a bad winter, and how he had never spoken about it, but she had heard him through the barn wall and had chosen not to speak of it because she knew he needed the privacy. She told him about the way Robert had held her hand in church not as a social performance, but because he simply liked the contact. Graham listened to all of it with the full attention he gave to everything that mattered, and when she was done he said, "He sounds like a man who deserved the life he had." "He did," Ellen said. "He deserved more of it than he got." "Yes," Graham said simply. They sat in the kitchen for another long moment, and then Ellen reached across the table and put her hand over Graham's, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they stayed like that for a while without talking, and it was, Ellen thought, the most comfortable she had felt in the world since the world had stopped making sense. In March, the calves came. Ellen's small herd produced 12 calves over the course of 3 weeks, which was a better outcome than she had feared and close to what the best possible scenario had been. And each birth was a complicated and exhausting event that she managed largely alone, though Graham came for 3 of them and was an expert and efficient calving assistant, something that struck her as deeply useful and also somehow very attractive in a way she found slightly ridiculous. 12 calves meant that by June she would have 12 additional animals to sell, which meant that the spring drive and sale would pay off Graham's loan and leave her with a surplus for the first time in 2 years. She did the arithmetic 3 times and it came out the same each time, and she sat with the almanac and the paper in her lap in the spring sunlight on the porch and felt something she could only identify as the specific pleasure of a problem coming right. Graham came by that afternoon and she showed him the numbers and he looked at them and said, "You have done this." "We have done this," she said. "The calves are yours," he said. "The planning is yours. The knowledge about the draw is yours," she said. "The loan is yours. The roof is yours and the fence. We have done this." Graham looked at her in the spring afternoon with the new grass coming up green in the south pasture and the calves visible in the distance moving on their uncertain legs, and he said, "Ellen." And she said, "Yes." And he said, "I would like to ask you something." Ellen put the almanac down. The spring wind was warm and smelled of grass and rain and something new. "I know that it has only been a few months," Graham said, "and I know that there is no requirement to rush anything. But I also know my own mind, and I believe I know something of yours, and I would rather be honest about what I am thinking than continue to be patient in a way that starts to feel dishonest." Ellen looked at him steadily. "I would like to marry you," Graham said. "Not soon necessarily if you need more time, but I want you to know that it is what I want, and I want to know if it is something you can consider." The question sat in the warm spring air between them. Ellen had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it with the same methodical thoroughness that she brought to every important question, turning it over, examining the sides of it, asking herself the honest questions. Did she love him? She had spent a great deal of the winter asking herself this, and the answer she kept arriving at, cautiously and then with increasing confidence, was yes. Not the same as what she had felt for Robert, because she was not the same person she had been at 23 and Graham was not Robert and she would not want to repeat what she had had. What she felt for Graham was its own thing, built from different material, from months of honesty and work and mutual respect and the specific warmth of someone who knew her and chose her eyes open. Did she trust him? Completely. Did she want a life with him? She looked at the Underwood ranch in her mind's eye, and she looked at her own homestead, and she thought about what it would mean to bring these two things together, and she thought about the calves in the south pasture, and the renewed lease and the 17 books on the shelf and the 2 cups on the kitchen table that had become normal, and she thought, yes, this is a life I can build. "I can consider it," Ellen said. "I have been considering it if I am honest." Graham let out a breath. "And," he said. Ellen met his eyes. "And I think the answer is yes," she said. "If you are patient with me about how it unfolds, I need to find the pace of it." "I have never been more willing to be patient about anything in my life," Graham said. She laughed, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time she laughed in front of him, that specific helpless attention, and she thought she would probably never get entirely used to being looked at that way and was glad of it. They did not rush it. April came and May, and they continued in the pattern they had established, working and talking and spending time together in the ease of people who have made a decision, and are letting it become real at its own pace. Graham came to church with her on Sundays, which caused Martha Greer to abandon all pretense of mere observation and begin, with Ellen's amused tolerance, making quiet preparations for a celebration. Graham wrote to his sister Helen in San Antonio to tell her of his intentions, and Helen's reply, which arrived in May, was a letter of such concentrated enthusiasm and detailed wedding planning opinion that Graham read it aloud to Ellen on the porch with the expression of a man who has summoned a force of nature and must now deal with the consequences. Ellen listened to the letter and then said, "She sounds exactly like what you said she was." "She is going to want to come," Graham said. "Let her come," Ellen said. "I would like to meet the woman who has been telling you about your personal failures for 8 years. She will tell you about them too," Graham said. "Good," Ellen said. "I want a complete picture." In June, they took the cattle to the sale in Calico Creek. All 43 animals, including the 12 calves that were now 3 months old and healthy. And the price was good that season, better than it had been in 2 years because the previous hard winter had thinned herds across the county, and demand was up. Ellen sold 30 of her animals and kept 13 back as breeding stock, a core herd that was leaner than what she had started with when Robert was alive but sound and healthy. And after the sale, she paid Graham back the loan in full, every cent with the modest interest they had agreed on. And she handed him the money and he counted it, because she wanted him to count it, and he said it was correct, and she felt the specific satisfaction of an obligation honorably met. They used a small portion of the proceeds to replace 2 sections of the barn that Darnell had marked as beyond repair, and they hired a local carpenter to do the job properly. And by mid-June, the Hadley homestead was in the best condition it had been in since before Robert's death. It was in the middle of June that Graham asked her again, more formally. He came to the homestead on a Sunday evening after church, and he had put on his good coat, the one he wore to town, and he had brought wildflowers that he had clearly picked himself from the verge of the road, because they were the kind of flowers that grew wild on the road between his ranch and hers, not florist flowers but real ones. And Ellen saw him coming and saw the flowers, and understood the quality of the moment before he said a word. They stood on the porch together, and Graham held the flowers somewhat awkwardly, because he was a practical man, and the carrying of flowers was not a motion he performed naturally, and Ellen thought that his awkwardness was among the most endearing things she had ever seen in her life. Ellen Catherine Hadley, Graham said, and he had asked for her middle name 3 weeks previous, and she had told him it, and had wondered at the time why he wanted to know. I would like to ask you to be my wife. I know that I have asked before and you said yes, but I wanted to ask again properly, with the flowers and the Sunday coat, because you deserve the proper asking. Ellen looked at him in the June evening light with the wildflowers and the Sunday coat and the expression of a man who is serious and nervous and entirely honest. Graham Thomas Underwood, she said, because she also knew his middle name. She had found it in the county records when she had been doing research at the land office, and she had been saving it. Yes, my answer is yes. Graham let out a breath and smiled, and it was a wide, unguarded smile that she had not seen from him before, the smile of a man who has stopped managing his expression, and it changed his whole face into something that made her chest hurt with warmth. He gave her the flowers, and she put them in a jar of water on the kitchen table, where they stayed until they were dry, and she pressed them flat in the back of the Dickens, between the last page and the back cover, where they remained. They were married in August, at the church in Calico Creek on a Saturday morning, when the summer heat was already doing its worst, but the church was full, and the windows were open, and Martha Greer had decorated every available surface with wild flowers and prairie grass, and the effect was beautiful in a rough-edged, honest way that felt exactly right. Ellen Underwood had come from San Antonio with her husband and 3 children, and she was exactly as Graham had described her, opinionated and forceful, and clearly devoted to her brother. She had also taken a comprehensive and detailed interest in Ellen within approximately 20 minutes of their introduction, and had then, with the directness of someone who has decided they approve of something, announced that Ellen was the best possible thing that had happened to Graham since their father taught him to ride. Ellen liked her enormously. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Calloway, who had been the minister in Calico Creek for 6 years, and who married people with a practical and warm efficiency that Ellen appreciated. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but when Ellen said them, she meant each specific word in a way that felt different from saying them the first time, not more or less, but specific to what she was doing now, the particular choice she was making, the particular person she was making it toward. Graham, when he said them, looked at her the whole time, only at her. As though the church full of people did not exist, and there was only this exchange between 2 people who had learned each other honestly, and had decided, with their eyes fully open, to go forward together. They rode to the Underwood ranch after the ceremony and the celebration, and Pete and Calhoun and Darnell had decorated the ranch porch with lanterns, and Henry had prepared a celebratory meal that was one of the best things Ellen had eaten in years. And they sat on that porch with Helen and her family, and Pete and Calhoun and Darnell and Martha Greer and her husband, who had all ridden out. And the lanterns made the ranch yard warm in the August dark, and the stars were out in their extraordinary clear way. Ellen and Graham sat side by side on the porch bench, shoulders touching, and Helen was telling a story about Graham at the age of 12 that he was trying to interrupt and failing, and Ellen was laughing, and the sound of her own laugh felt like something she had recovered from a distance. The Hadley homestead was managed as a part of the expanded Underwood operation after the marriage, which was the practical arrangement they had worked out together. Ellen kept the property and its core herd, and the deed remained in her name, because Graham had been emphatic about this, and Ellen had been grateful for the emphasis. The two properties operated as linked but distinct, the way two good things can complement each other without losing their own character. Ellen moved into the Underwood house because it was larger and better built, and because Graham had been there for 20 years, and it was his home in a way that mattered. She brought her 17 books and the cedar chest and the tin box of important documents and the photograph of Robert that she kept on the bedside table. And Graham never said a word about the photograph, because he was the kind of man who understood that love is not a competition, and that honoring what came before is not a threat to what is. She hung the photograph and unpacked her books onto the large shelf in the study that Graham had cleared specifically for her library, and she stood in that study looking at her books mixed with Graham's law books and his history books and the Texas almanacs, and she thought that this was what a shared life looked like, two people's things making a third thing that belonged to both of them. The autumn of 1878 turned into the autumn of 1879, and the Underwood ranch prospered. The combined herds were better managed than either had been separately, and Ellen's instinct for cattle health and Graham's knowledge of the range made them a genuinely effective partnership, which was what she had wanted from the beginning without quite knowing how to say so. She also started keeping a small school for the children of the ranch hands and the two neighboring families whose properties were close enough, because she was a schoolteacher's daughter, and there was no school within practical distance for these children, and it occupied her Tuesday mornings through the winter, and she found it profoundly satisfying in a way she had not anticipated. 4 children to begin with, growing to 7 by the spring, sitting at the kitchen table in the big Underwood house learning their letters and their figures while Henry made coffee in the background and tried not to eavesdrop. In the spring of 1879, Ellen discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Graham on a Tuesday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table after the children had gone home, and she told him simply and watched his face. Graham's face went through several things very quickly, and the thing it settled on was something that she would remember for the rest of her life, a pure and undefended joy, the face of a man who has just been given something he had not let himself fully hope for. He came around the table and took both her hands and said, "Ellen," and then seemed to have temporarily run out of words, which was unusual for him, and she laughed and he laughed, and they stayed at the kitchen table holding hands in the April morning, while through the window the south pasture was bright green with new grass, and the cattle moved slowly through it, and the sky was enormous and blue. The pregnancy was not without difficulty. Ellen was 33, which was not old but was not young for a first child, and she was practical enough about the reality of childbirth in 1879 to take nothing for granted. She was careful and continued to work at a reduced intensity, because idleness was impossible for her by nature, and Graham watched over her with a protective attention that was occasionally excessive, and that she addressed directly, and that he modestly adjusted. Helen came back from San Antonio in August, 6 weeks before the expected date, which was the right decision because, when the time came, it came fast, on a hot September evening when the light was still gold in the windows, And it was Helen who helped, and it was Graham who paced the hall outside, and it was Henry who made coffee that nobody drank. And in the end, everything went as well as could be hoped, and the baby was a boy. They named him Robert James Underwood, the Robert for Robert Hadley and the James for Graham's father. And it was the right name, the name of two men who had built things in this country and had deserved more time than they got. The baby was healthy and loud, and had Graham's dark hair and Ellen's particular expression of focused determination, which she recognized with amusement and pride in equal measure. Graham held him with the careful, astonished attention of a man who has been given something fragile and extraordinary, and is fully aware of both qualities. Helen stayed for 2 weeks after the birth and was genuinely helpful, and only gave unsolicited advice 11 times in 14 days, which Graham counted and reported to Ellen in a whispered accounting that made her laugh in a way that was probably not good for her recovery, but that she did not regret. The first year of Robert James Underwood's life coincided with one of the best cattle years the region had seen in a decade. The rainfall was good, and the grass was good, and the market was strong, and the combined Underwood-Hadley operation came through the year with a surplus that allowed them to pay off a modest outstanding debt on the ranch's North Pasture lease, and to put money aside in the way that had not been possible for several years. Ellen continued her small school through that year, managing it with the baby in a basket beside the table, which the children found distracting in a positive way, and which she found was actually a reasonable way to do two things at once. By the following spring she had 9 children attending, and she wrote to the county school board about establishing a formal school in the area, and the county school board wrote back with the particular mixture of encouragement and bureaucratic delay that county school boards have always specialized in. Graham, who had kept his father's law books and knew their contents reasonably well, helped Ellen draft the formal petition to the school board with the precision of someone who knows how official documents work, and they sent the petition in the spring of 1880 and waited. The autumn of 1880 brought a second pregnancy, which Ellen received with the cautious optimism of someone who has been through it once and knows the landscape. This pregnancy was easier than the first, in the mysterious way that second pregnancies sometimes are, and on a cold March morning in 1881, in the same room of the Underwood house where Robert James had arrived, a daughter came into the world. Graham named her. He said he had been thinking about it for weeks, and the name he had arrived at was Clara, after a great-aunt of his who had been, by all accounts, a woman of substantial character and no patience for nonsense. Ellen said the name was perfect, and it was. Clara Underwood was dark-eyed and quiet and observant from her first weeks of life, and Robert James, who was a year and a half old and deeply interested in everything, regarded his new sister with the solemn curiosity of a small person encountering something that has arrived in his world without his prior approval. The county school board approved the formal school petition in the summer of 1881, and Ellen became the first official teacher of the Calico Creek South School, which was a small building that the community raised on a Saturday in September on a piece of the Underwood property that Graham donated for the purpose. Ellen taught 6 days a week through the school terms with 2 children under 2 years old, and a husband who brought her lunch to the schoolhouse 3 days a week without fail, because he had decided this was part of his contribution to the enterprise, and nobody argued with him about it. Martha Greer sent her eldest daughter to the school and told anyone who would listen that Ellen Underwood was the finest teacher in the county, which was probably true simply because she was the only teacher in the county in this part of the range, but the quality was genuine regardless. By the winter of 1881, the Hadley homestead had been renovated and was being used as additional housing for the senior ranch hands, Darnell and Henry, who had graduated to the status of nearly family in the way that long-serving employees sometimes do. The original house was comfortable and warm with its repaired roof and properly maintained fences, and sometimes Ellen rode over there on a weekday afternoon, while Graham was working the far range, and stood in the kitchen of the house. She had managed alone and thought about the morning she had been carrying timber through the mud, and a man on a gray horse had stopped on the road. She thought about what she had been that morning. The specific quality of her aloneness, the pride in it and the weight of it, the way she had refused to look defeated even when she was one knee-deep in mud and very close to it. She did not regret any of it. She thought the person she had been that morning was admirable in her stubbornness, and in her grief, and in her absolute refusal to stop working, and she thought that the same stubbornness had made her able to look at Graham Underwood honestly when he said he could not ride past again, and to know that the honest thing was to let him stop. She thought about the timber, specifically, those rough cedar posts that she had been hauling one at a time through the November mud. The fence they had built that morning was still standing, 4 years later. She had checked it when she rode over. The posts were settling in the way that well-planted fence posts settle, deep and solid, and the wire was tight, and she had put her hand on the top rail of the fence that Graham had helped her build and had felt something warm and good, the way a thing made in good faith holds its integrity across time. In the spring of 1882, Graham and Ellen sat on the porch of the Underwood house in the long evening light, the good spring light that turned everything gold, and Robert James was running in the yard the way small children run, with the specific joy of having a body that goes where they point it, and Clara was sitting in Ellen's lap with one of her mother's 17 books open in front of her. Not reading it yet, but turning the pages with solemn, deliberate attention, in a way that made Ellen feel that the schoolteacher's granddaughter had arrived in the world, with certain inclinations already determined. Graham was watching his son run, and his wife read to their daughter, and he had his coffee, and the evening was warm, and the range was green, and the cattle were healthy, and the school building was visible in the distance at the end of the road, the building that had been built in a day by the community. And he thought that he had been patient for a long time about a good many things in his life, and that patience had proven to be among the better decisions he had made. Ellen looked up from the book and found him looking at her, and she did not look away. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I am an embarrassingly contented man," Graham said, "and that you are responsible for it." "I am responsible for approximately half of it," Ellen said. "You did the other half." "The fence," Graham said. She smiled. "The fence," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, the way he did, his hand large and warm over hers, and they sat in the evening light while Robert James ran in wide circles in the yard, and Clara turned the pages of the Dickens with her small, certain hands, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east, coming out one by one over the caprock in the way they always did, and soon the whole sky above the Texas plains would be full of them, extraordinary and clear, and Ellen would name them as she always did. Orion and the Pleiades and Cassiopeia for the children who were already sleeping and would one day know them all. The ranch was prospering. The school was real. The house was full of voices. The fence was standing. The cedar posts she had hauled through the mud, alone and proud and exhausted and not crying about it, on a November morning in 1878 had held. Everything had held. And on the road at the edge of her property, on that same stretch of red clay that turned to red clay soup in the rain, a gray horse had stopped and a man had said, with the plainness of something undeniable, that he could not ride past again. She was glad every single day that he had not. Graham squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and that was enough. That was the whole thing right there. Two people who had found each other honestly on a muddy November morning and had built something true from the ground up, post by post and wire by wire, the way everything worth having in this hard and beautiful country was built, slowly and with intention and with both hands. The stars came out all the way across the Texas sky, and Ellen Underwood named them softly to herself, her daughter asleep in her lap, her son coming now to the porch steps with grass on his knees and his father's eyes and a question about supper. And the lamp was lit in the window behind her, the same window that had burned before anyone else was stirring, and after dark, the widow's light that a man on a road had been unable to ride past. Only now it was not a widow's light. It was simply a home.